Hi, everyone. Welcome to Science Talk Season 3. My name is Johan, and I will be the host tonight and probably for the rest of the season. I'd like to say hi to Josh and Tiffany, the former host, if they're in the audience or helping maybe in the back. Thanks for coming tonight. And tonight, so as some of you probably know, Science Talk is a virtual science cafe, and we decided to remain online for obvious reason, and we started online, and we will remain online for this season from September to December with 4 amazing talks. And the goal is to explore the latest ideas of research and science, and we understand research and science, and particularly science in a broad spectrum, not just the hard science, but we've included the humanities, philosophy, and history, and other very interesting topics, as you will discover with us. And for the program, so as we've done it before, we will have a talk from an expert. And we started the first series we started with the 4 research chair from U of V. And then the second and third series, we continue with scientists from Research Center at U of V. And there is a rich body of research. Even I've learned it this morning. A professor actually from U of V emailed me and encouraged me to look also at other places, other faculties, not only the centers and the chairs. So I think that's very promising for further science talk and further edition. And as we know, I'm sure by now, after a year and a half of Zoom, you know the Zoom etiquette and how all of this works. But during the Q&A, you'll have the occasion to use your raise your hand feature. But I think mostly it's to people that have used the chat room, and then you can leave all your questions there. And the event is being recorded so that we can disseminate further on YouTube especially. And I've looked at some of the former talks, and some have been viewed quite a lot, and that's very encouraging for us and for research here in the Fraser Valley. And at Science Talk, we decided to have a sort of a community agreement, kind of to frame the conversation tonight. And as mentioned, yeah, it is a conversation with an expert and not a debate. And this is for maybe an obvious reason to some, but maybe not for everyone. It's just that when we come and we invite an expert, often I am, or people in the team, or other people are not expert on that team, even though we might have a tendency to think that we can quickly learn a new expertise. It actually takes a lot of time and reflection and studies to become an expert. So what we want to do is to give that platform to participate and ask questions. And we welcome a wide range of questions. We encourage participation, equal participation in a safe environment. We want to encourage curiosity, open-mindedness, discussion, inclusion, and generosity in the arguments that are presented. And there's no agenda and self-promotion. So we hope that's the community agreement that we're hoping that everybody is agreeing when they join us tonight. And we'd like to thank our sponsor and partners, and especially University of the Fraser Valley that has supported this project from the get-go. Connect and TEDx Abbotsford that help us with crafting, designing the program, and with websites and spreading the news in the community. And we'd like also to thank the U of V Alumni Association, who's helping us also to bring this science talk to their community. And the project started with a neighborhood grant from the Abbotsford Community Foundation and the City of Abbotsford. And the grant was especially crafted designed to help community in time of social distancing. So we really hope to bring the community together tonight and in the different science talk, and to learn more about science. And I also like to thank Envision that also have supported us from the beginning. But enough about me, enough about the program, enough about this. And I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Wenona Hall. She's the chair of Indigenous Studies program at the University of the Fraser Valley. She has a Ph.D. in Indigenous governance from SFU. And tonight she will speak to us about the science of story work and the power of Sxwoxwiyam. And please forgive my pronunciation. I'm struggling with different languages here. First with English, as English is not my first language. French is, and I also have some German, grew up in a German-speaking and French-speaking environment, originally from Switzerland. So I'm struggling with that language, and I'm very excited to have you here to help me unpack this. And I'm also struggling with not struggling, I'm also eager to learn more about Indigenous history and stories. As I mentioned, I came here to Canada a couple of years ago, and when I was talking with Wenona earlier, I was mentioning when I've learned history, and now being here in Canada, discovering a lot of new history or a new eye on history. I'm very eager to learn with you tonight and to unlearn some of the things I've learned in the past and to learn new things with you. So without further ado, the floor is yours, and I will let you, I think, share your screen. And I've already seen in the chat an acknowledgement of the traditional, ancestral, unceded shared territory that we're on. And I think Wenona will also mention that. If she can unmute.
Am I unmuted now?
No, you're good. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Okay. Oh, good. Okay. Thank you, Johan, and everybody who has been a part of organizing this event and for inviting me to be a part of it. I'm very excited to be here. And I just want to start with a bit of a disclaimer, maybe, that I am extremely nervous. I was explaining to Johan earlier. It's been a while. I've been on sabbatical for the past year, and I don't know if you've all heard, but we're kind of coming out of a pandemic lately. So there's been a lot of changes. And so, yeah, I've been quite nervous. I put together a presentation for you. I hope that it goes well. And by all means, if there's any questions or comments, I hope that we have time at the end to go over some of those. And also, as I go through my presentation, I've also roped in my daughter to come and help me this evening as well, Jade Victor. She just recently graduated from UFE with her bachelor's degree and will be starting grad school in the fall. So I helped her a lot with some of her studies, so I got her to come and help me this evening as well with a few of the stories. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and start with the presentation. I'm going to introduce myself in Halkomelem, which is the language of the upriver Stalo people. A Salat, Siaya, Siam, Sialialaqua, Sialialaqua, Squalamat, Telsqui, Talitsaqa, Salek. So I'm saying good evening to all of my respected ones. I'm happy to see some of my community members online, and I see a few of my colleagues from UFE and a few leaders that I just want to acknowledge and say thank you for being here. I'm also acknowledging all our dear loved ones that are with us this evening, as well as our old people and our ancestors. I'm letting you know that my ancestral name is Sxwoxwiyam, which comes from my paternal grandfather's great-great-great-grandmother, and that I'm from the Sxwoxwiyam tribe, which we now say in English as Chilliwack. So I'm always pretty proud to let everyone know that Chilliwack was named after the Sxwoxwiyam tribe. So as I move forward, I'm going to be sharing a few stories with you this evening, a couple of Sxwoxwiyam and one Sxwoxwiyam. But before I do that, I need to do a little bit of work ahead of time just to sort of get everybody ready for what they're going to hear and how they might want to engage with the stories that I'm sharing. And I also want to just let you know that by locating myself through my Halkomelem introduction and through my ancestral name, that it is through my father's ancestry that I derive this inherent right to share my story and my stories. And that on my mother's side, that my mother is a settler from the Kickbush family. I also want to acknowledge a few other of my teachers, for example, Soft Tumuk, which is our land for Indigenous peoples Our land is a source of knowledge. It's a way of knowing and a pedagogy even. Our Sxwoxwiyam, which Johan did a great job of saying, I think, which are our ancient stories, and I'll share a bit more about that in a bit. Our Sxwoxwiyam, which we now in English say as elders, but the actual translation is old people. And it's just one of those differences in language where sometimes when you call someone an old person, they might be offended, whereas before to be an old person was highly regarded and esteemed. And Sxwoxwiyam, which is our ancestors. So I just want to acknowledge that a lot of what I'm going to be sharing with you this evening comes from all of those sources. And as well, a special acknowledgement to Sxwoxwiyam, also known in English as Dr. Joanne Archibald, who did her Ph.D. dissertation on Indigenous storywork. I put up a picture there of her textbook for you in educating the heart, mind, body, and spirit. And it is through her work that I have come to learn a fair deal. I'm still not a storyteller. Sxwoxwiyam is, but I have come to learn and to respect how to work with story in a good way. So I just want to acknowledge her as one of my main teachers this evening, and that she has coined the term story work, which I think is important. And we're going to do a little bit of pre-story work before I share stories with you. So I just want to acknowledge that. So before we begin engaging in Sxwoxwiyam and story as a science, I think there's some paradigm shifts that need to happen for those of us who were raised within the English language, and especially here in Canada as part of the colonial relationship that we have here. Because if we don't do a little bit of decolonizing work first, we might actually miss some of the nuances and some of the better, beautiful parts of what it means to learn from story and Sxwoxwiyam. And the other part is why I want to start with looking at decolonizing relationships is because I'm also acknowledging that there's a huge gap, even if I look at the gap between like my settler family and my Indigenous family. And that sometimes I fear that that gap is so large, I'm not sure sometimes how we're even going to bridge it or get across it. But I do know that there's effort now on both sides to bridge that gap, and that the will is there. So the next thing that we're looking at is the how. How do we go about decolonizing these relationships in a good way? So I look at it as a form of transformation, which is one of the teachings from Chachals in terms of the power of transformation. So changing that colonial relationship of assumed Euro-Canadian and Eurocentric thought, the notions of assimilation and all the various acts of erasure that have happened through the colonial era into this new relationship. And I like to focus on the R's. They're mentioned in Dr. Archibald's text, as well as from work from Michelle Pidgeon in terms of recognition, that Indigenous peoples are here and will always be here. Recognition that Indigenous peoples have valuable knowledge systems and ways of knowing. Reciprocity in terms of sharing, respect, responsibility, and of course, we're now entering the era of reconciliation. And a lot of people will argue that we can't really begin to reconcile until we know what it is exactly that we're reconciling. So to begin, I do want to share a story, and I'm going to get my daughter to share this story with you. This story is from Sxwoxwiyam, from Dr. Joanne Archibald's textbook. And I did go on to use it as part of my MA research on Stalo justice as well. And as my daughter reads it to you, I just want to ask you to empty your mind of all your sort of daily tasks that you did today, empty your mind of all the things that you need to do tomorrow, and just center yourself and be present here in this moment and just indulge in listening to this great story. And I'm going to ask my daughter to read it for you.
Coyote searching for the bone needle. Old Man Coyote had just finished a long, hard day of hunting. He decided to set up his camp for the night. After supper, he sat by the fire and rubbed his tired feet from the long day's walk. He took his favorite moccasins out of his bag and noticed that there was a hole in the toe of one of them. He looked for his special bone needle to mend the moccasins, but he couldn't feel it in the bag. Old Man Coyote started to crawl on his hands and knees around the fire to see if he could see or feel the needle. Just then, Owl came flying by and landed next to Old Man Coyote. He asked him what he was looking for. Old Man Coyote told Owl his problem. Owl said that he would help his friend look for the bone needle. After he made one swoop around the area of the fire, he told Old Man Coyote that he didn't see the needle. Owl said that if it were around the fire, then he would have spotted it. He then asked Old Man Coyote where he last used the needle. Old Man Coyote said that he used it quite far away, over in the bushes, to mend his jacket. Then Owl asked Old Man Coyote why he was searching for the needle around the campfire. Old Man Coyote replied, "Well, it's easier to look for the needle here because the fire gives off such good light, and I can see better here."
So is my screen being presented?
We cannot see your
Yes.
screen. right
You
now.
can or cannot?
We cannot. You have to share your slides, right?
Oh, I'm not sharing my slides? Okay, hold
No,
on.
but that's okay. We've seen your daughter. That was great.
Yeah.
I think to tell a story, it's better than to see a person than slides.
Okay. Okay, well,
You can
because
share your screen now if you want to.
yeah. We're both wearing shorts, but I'm sure all of you have also worn shorts when you're on a Zoom call.
Me too. I think that was the day. It was hot today. So I think it's great.
Okay, let me see, where am I?
Go back to Zoom.
This one?
Yep.
Or this one?
Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter. Okay, there we go.
Okay, the other one.
This one? Now what?
Share it right there.
Right here?
And then you select your PowerPoint.
Okay. Okay, there we go.
And then you can go back to your PowerPoint now
From current slide.
and make it bigger.
I think we'll invite your daughter for
I
tech
know,
support.
Isn't she?
Tech support in the for the next science talk. I think
Yeah,
she's
you
great.
gotta-
Thank you.
Love these Gen X, Gen Y, millennials. Okay, so there is a slide there for you. And now you can see my screen, my
Yeah.
presentation. Okay. So thank you, Jay, for sharing that story with us. And she'll be back in a bit to share another one. So with that story, I'm just going to let that sit with you and think about it as I sort of move through the rest of my presentation. And so I think one of the first things that perhaps we need to agree on as we move forward in learning how to work with story is that story and story work, according to the Stalo worldview, is it's a legitimate, reliable, credible, and valid way of coming to understand our world, and most importantly, our place within it. To help with us, we need to challenge certain of our colonial ideologies that have proven to not serve us very well. So for example, Eurocentric thought, and of course, colonialism is grounded within this notion of Eurocentrism. And it's the assumption that anything European and or Euro-Canadian is somehow superior to anything Indigenous. And of course, that is not the case, that we know that now. And then a very close cousin to Eurocentrism is racism. So needing to sort of set aside and challenge our stereotypes, challenge our white privilege. And I really encourage people to have a look at the video that Dr. Keith Carlson did. I thought he did an excellent job of talking about white privilege and how we can address that. This notion of being colorblind, and the deficit model, of course, needs to be done away with when we look at challenges and issues that Indigenous peoples may be facing today. Quite often we fall to the deficit model that it's something within the Indigenous person that is leading to these challenges, when of course it's not. It's the colonial process and colonial systems that have done that. And then last, which is most important for my presentation, is challenging this notion that the Western worldview is the worldview, instead of seeing it as one of many different ways of knowing. And that there are other worldviews that are just as legitimate, just as valid, credible, and reliable as our own worldview. And when I say different, I'm not necessarily meaning that one is better than the other. Like, I think difference is just that, different. I always like to use this screen here, but I changed when it says the children in America are forced to spend over 8 hours sitting in classrooms. Then they are drugged when they move too much or make too much noise. And their primary source of entertainment is, and I changed that to the cell phone nowadays, the iPhone. And then the other child responds, that's horrible. We should take up a donation for them. And so I just like this little meme because it's a way for us to think differently about our own worldview and to challenge it a bit. Along with that comes this, I remember taking philosophy at university and spending a whole semester around this notion of I think, therefore I am, and I struggled with it, as did a lot of Indigenous students struggle with philosophy 101. Whereas if we sort of moved more into this, I am because we are way of looking at the world, I think a lot of Indigenous students and other students would fare better in philosophy. So the other thing too is worldview differences mean that we differ in our beliefs in how we came to be. Right? So some believe in evolution stories, some believe in creation stories. One of my favorite stories about how we came to be is from William Sapass from my community here at Sxwoxwiyam, who tells the story about father-son falling in love with Mother Moon. And in his attempt to try to reach her, he grabbed a piece of bark and wrote her a love letter, and then he flung it across the cosmos to try to reach her, and it landed and is now here. We now call her Mother Earth, or it's now known as Earth. So it's an interesting way to look at the Earth coming to be as the result of a love letter. I also like to share a little bit about worldview differences from Leroy Littlebear, who is a metaphysicist who works in philosophy and is a Blackfoot. He has a lot of videos that are available on YouTube if you care to look him up. All of his videos are fantastic. It's just full of information. So I pulled out here a few of the differences that he likes to highlight and talk about, just so that we can come to understand how it is that we can be talking about story, but have two very different ways of engaging with it. So for example, he explains that within the Indigenous worldview, that everything is always in constant flux. We believe that everything is animate. For the Stalo, we have a word, it's Sxwoxwiyam, which is life force. We believe everything has life force. And because everything is animate and everything has Sxwoxwiyam, everything is interconnected and everything is interrelated. And then another part of this worldview is that subjective knowledge is actually held in higher regard than objective knowledge, which is the complete opposite of the Western worldview. And then our languages, if you look at Indigenous languages, they're very verb driven as opposed to noun driven. So even as we learn to speak, and the power of language very much cements our worldview and how we use that language. I'm sharing here with you a few Halkomelem terms. I can't go over all of them this evening. I am going to be talking about Sxwoxwiyam, which are the ancient stories. And then my daughter is going to be sharing a Sxwoxwiyam, which is another Stalo form of orature in terms of coming to understand the world. And the top one there is Halkomelem, which is what I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. It is the upriver language of the Stalo people. So I am now going to get my daughter Jade to share a Sxwoxwiyam. So Sxwoxwiyam are ancient stories, whereas our Sxwoxwiyam tend to be of more of a contemporary current time, but they're stories that are designed to teach certain values and to teach you about your place in the world. And this is a Sxwoxwiyam from Sxwoxwiyam from Dr. Joanne Archibald's book. So I'm going to put her back on.
My dream. I was alone in a canoe and approaching land. There was a longhouse close to the water. As the canoe reached shore, many of the old people came out to greet me. The old ones were those who had passed on, or as we say, traveled to the spirit world. I recognized many: Ed Leon, Teresa Michael, Suzanne Peters, Frances Kelly, Jean Silver, and some I did not know. As I walked closer to them, I started to cry. I cried because I realized at that moment how much I missed them. I told them that it was so hard living in the city and working at the university, living and working in a place where it was a constant struggle to be First Nations, to think and feel in a cultural way, and to be understood by others, the outsiders. I told them that I wanted to leave the cool place and stay with them. They put a woven blanket around me, like the one a spokesperson wears in our cultural gatherings, and brought me into the longhouse. Inside, each one started to talk to me. All I could see was each one talking. It was like watching a scene on television, but with the volume turned off. In the dream, I could not hear what they were telling me, but the talk went on for a long, long time. When it was finished, they brought me outside and put me back in the canoe. They said I had to go back, that I wouldn't be lonely anymore, and that I had important work to do yet.
Thank you, Jade. I remember reading this story from Dr. Archibald, and at the time I was also working on my Ph.D. and I remember thinking, oh, I wish I could have a dream like that would sort of help center me and help guide me. And I eventually actually did have my own dream. But if there's time later, I'll share it with you because it's actually kind of humorous. So next I'm going to share with you a Sxwoxwiyam. And so we're going to keep in mind that to us, Sxwoxwiyam have Sholi. Sxwoxwiyam are alive, that there's something to be treasured and to be gifted and to be treated very respectfully and very carefully, which is unlike, so for example, if you think about the Western form of story, or you think about Hansel and Gretel, or any story that might come to mind, it doesn't necessarily come with a whole bunch of protocol in terms of how to treat it or work with it or pass it along. And so for us, we need to be mindful that for Sxwoxwiyam, there is a lot of protocol that is involved in working with it and engaging with it in respectful ways. And I've just always liked Carlson's quote here about that Sxwoxwiyam are a means by which ancestors of the past interact with people of the present in shaping the future. And so I'm just going to end my presentation with a Sxwoxwiyam. I do need to let you know that just like I'm not a biologist or a chemist or a physicist, I'm not a storyteller either. But just as non-mathematicians can work with and engage with rudimentary math, I think that I too, and all of us actually, can engage with Sxwoxwiyam, but understanding that as I share with you my engagement with Sxwoxwiyam, that it's my engagement with this story, that to become a storyteller, it takes a lot of work. Dr. Joanne Archibald is a storyteller, as is Sunny McKelsey, and most of our Stalo families all have a grandmother or an auntie or an uncle that is our storyteller for our family. So this Sxwoxwiyam is about a Stalo woman whose name is Heath Lakey. And Heath Lakey's, it was her job to look after all the Stalo people. And the story goes that one day she was down on like what is now known as Washington state side of our territory. And she fell in love with a man named Coyote. And so she ended up deciding to stay there in his village with him. And they went on to have 3 daughters and 3 sons, but that eventually she became lonely for her own territory and wanted to come back to the Stalo people. So she left Coyote, her husband, and made her way back up this way to live with her own people in her own village. And when she came, she brought her 3 daughters and her 3 sisters and their dog. with them. And so the story goes that she lived out the rest of her years doing what she always wanted to do and enjoyed doing, which was looking after the Stalo people and all of our resources and everything that goes along with the Stalo, by the way, is our river, but we now refer to ourselves as the Stalo people. So looking after our river and all the people that are attached to that. And then one day, Hals, which is one of our transformers, came across Heath Lakey. And by this time, she was very, very old. And this is back in a time when Stalo people and Indigenous peoples, we lived to be like into our hundreds. If you look at our diet and pretty low stress lifestyle, it's not surprising that we easily lived into 110, 114, 120 years of age. So not really sure, but she was so old that she couldn't see anymore, and she didn't have her mobility anymore. And she wasn't able to move around and do her job of looking after the people. So when Hals came across her, she was crying because of this. So Hal said, well, here, let me help you. And he transformed her into a mountain so that she could always do her job and she could always look after the Stalo people. So this is the picture I have up here is Heath Lakey as her transformation into the mountain. In the front of her are the 3 peaks, are her 3 daughters. Behind her, she has her 3 sisters. You can see her dog's head there. And then also back there is Simcha, who is one of Heath Lakey's half-sister. And the story goes that Heath Lakey threw a stone at her when Simcha claimed to be a full sister when she was only a half-sister. And a lot of people now refer to her as Mount Sxwoxwiyam. So, and that's sort of, again, like one of those acts of erasure where we don't get to be called by our proper names anymore. So I'm always encouraging people to learn that her name is actually Heath Lakey, and to learn how to say it and to learn her story. And what I did with this Sxwoxwiyam was I used it as part of my dissertation to teach me about Stalo governing principles. So as you're listening to the story, all kinds of things probably stand out for you. And for me, it was what she taught me about proper governance for the Stalo. So, and that's the end of my presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you very much for this talk, fascinating presentation, and thank you for taking the time, especially after Labor Day and people. It's the first day of class, first day of school, so this is great to actually see a lot of participants coming tonight. And as mentioned earlier, please post your questions in the chat, and I'll have some questions for you. I found this fascinating and also very challenging if I look at the scientific method, Eurocentric scientific method to understand the world of bringing an hypothesis, experiment, collecting data, analyzing, replicating, experimenting, being able to test, and so that other scientists can also come up with the same conclusion or the same ideas. But on the other hand, I understand that stories are very powerful. And you did mention it was a bit different than Eurocentric stories, but I think even Europe, if we take the Judeo-Christian worldview that has shaped Europe, is based also on stories, the creation story and different stories. And there's ways of knowing there. And you also took philosophy class, and remember my friend, I was telling him I was struggling with analytical philosophy, and he was telling me to read French philosopher was way more interesting and it was way harder to understand. And he was saying me that it's hard to understand because it's so hard to pinpoint the complexity of our existence. We cannot put that into numbers and letters. It's way more than this. So my question is, first question, and then we'll hopefully there'll be a lot in the chat too, is when you say it's different than Eurocentric stories, how is that different than other type of creation stories?
I think, well, there's probably a lot of different ways, but perhaps what's most important is that because we now call Soth Tumach home, that the stories that come from this land are paramount, are important. Because when we learn about the Sxwoxwiyam, that are like, these stories are thousands and thousands of years old. Within those stories are ways for us to relate to each other, are ways for us to live in a good way, right? As we're here in South Tumach. Whereas if I were to travel to another part of the planet, I would want to learn those stories from that land, right? So I think that that's one of the big differences. The other one is probably just in terms of how separated people come from their stories. So for example, for the Stalo, we're still very connected to our stories. When we listen to and hear our Sxwoxwiyam, you know, our hairs stand up on the back of our neck, and we can just feel our ancestry like still there with us and talking to us and sharing with us and looking after us. Whereas I find in some, not all, but in some European situations, they're so far removed from those stories now that when they hear them, there's not that synergy, there's not that energy being exchanged anymore.
Yeah, thank you very much. And then then how would you enter a conversation with someone that comes more from a STEM background, like science, tech, in their way of, you know, the way they do lab work, trying to understand the world? How can you bridge that, if it's possible, and if it needs to be bridged?
I actually think that it does need to be bridged. So for my personal opinion is that one of the things that I find that we're doing in our educational system, to the detriment of us being able to further ourselves in a good way, is we're doing away with the imagination. We're doing away with the ability to dream of things that perhaps have not been dreamt of yet. Or if you think about children and the power of their imagination, and how at some point in the school system, we just lose that. It's no longer about our imagination. It is more about the sciences and learning your math and biology and the name of everything. And I think they're equally important. I'm not saying that one is more important than the other, but they do, I think, complement each other. And I mentioned Leroy Little Bear. There's a few other of the Indigenous scholars who actually, well, prior to COVID, used to meet. They would pick a spot and they would meet with, so the Indigenous scientists would meet with the Western scientists, and they would meet for a week, and they would just talk about things so that they could find places of similarity, or find, like, so when a physicist talks about a certain theory, the Indigenous scholar is like, oh, we have that theory too. We just don't call it that. Like, you call it chaos theory, we call it trickster theory, right? And then at the end of the day, they're very similar with each other.
Yeah, I think it will enrich the conversation. And if we are here to learn more about and understand the world we live in, that can only enrich the conversation. I would want to take some questions here, and I will start with Dr. Joanne McLean. And I thank you for coming, Dr. McLean, who is the president of UAV, and she has come to, I think, all of our science talk. I think we should create a medal for people that come to those events. So she says, thank you for sharing about Stolo culture and Al-Kwehel-Malem languages. Sorry for my French, my first language, French. Storytelling is so powerful, and we benefit so much from learning about life source and imagination and transformation. I appreciate the opportunity to listen and learn. So she not have so much of a question, but a word of affirmation, which I think it's very suited. And then here, let's look at other questions here. So from Brownie1 Barrett, if storywork and story differs in the way they are told by storytellers, how can they best be written down? Or are stories mainly passed from generation to generation orally?
So that's interesting, because they're not supposed to be written down. One of our teachings is, if something is really important to you, you don't write it down, you write it on your heart, is the saying. And there's some value to that. At the same time, though, I'm also conscious of what has happened with the colonial process, right? As Indigenous peoples, we're busy trying to survive a genocide. And one of the things which I'm sure everybody's coming to become more aware of is through, for example, residential schools. One of the first things that residential schools took away from us was our language. So then you have, children coming home from residential schools no longer understanding their grandparents, right, that are speaking Halkomelem and don't speak English. And luckily we had a few. I'm thinking of, for example, Yam Yamalot, the late Rosaline George, who shared the story about how she says, when they tried to take my language away from me, she goes, I was stubborn. And I just kept repeating it in my brain, in my mind. And I would just talk to myself in my mind and keep speaking my language. She goes, otherwise, when I go home, how am I going to talk to my grandma? I won't be able to speak with her. So there's stories like that, which means a lot of our Sxwoxwiyam didn't necessarily get passed down the way that it should have. So then you have anthropologists, though, that came along and recorded a lot of these stories. So they are available through audio recordings. And then there are also a few anthropologists who have published them as well. But there's some translation issues there. I think it's Franz Boas, I'm thinking, or sorry, might be getting the name wrong. But so, for example, he was told several Sxwoxwiyam in Halkomelem that he then translated into German, that was then translated into English and is now published, right? So, but for me, that's the exciting part of delving into those stories and sort of picking out sort of where, because some of the stories were changed as a result of that double, triple translation thing going on.
And to jump on that question, but how do you ensure to pass one story from one generation to the other? Because I mean, the naive questions for me is like, yeah, I tell someone this and then it comes back to me and it's like, well, that's not what I say. So I'm sure there's what I'll be curious to know more about the process of ensuring that the stories are shared.
I think is it called telephone?
Yeah, exactly. The telephone.
That's a lot of people jump to that because of course, I'm sure, I hope everyone's aware of that. Something we used to do in like elementary school where you sit in a circle, somebody says something to the next person, it goes all the way around the circle. And then when it comes back, it's really interesting to see how much it has morphed and changed. And sometimes isn't even anything close to the original statement that started the telephone circle. So, and what I ask people to do is, no, that's not what we're talking about here, to get that completely out of your mind when we're thinking about learning from story and story work. So one of the big things for how we learn is repetition, 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 repetition. So we're talking about children and young adults being told the story over and over and over and over again. And the thing about learning from oration is that if you do get it wrong, your teacher is right there to correct you. Whereas when we're learning from print, if you misunderstand that author isn't necessarily there to correct you. Whereas with learning through orature, there's rules to it. Just like there's grammatical rules, there's oral rules. Mm-hmm. Even right down to who has the right to tell the story. The only thing where there is a little bit of what I call leeway, it's not in the telling of the story, but it's in the listener's interpretation of the story. So for all the stories that I have heard, when I put forward like, oh, this is what I think of when I hear that, or this is what that story taught me, you're never corrected. You're never like, oh, that's not what that story's about, or that's right. Your own interpretation of how you engage with that story is what my uncle says, that's the lesson that you need to hear for where you are at in your life right now. When I tell you the story 10 years from now, you might learn something completely different because you're in a different place in your life. So that's sort of one of the power of story.
Mm-hmm. I think that works also with I mean, text too. When you read a story and then you read the same story 10 years from then, you're like, have come learn different points or live that story in a different way.
Yes, absolutely.
And other questions. So Cheryl McMath says she really appreciated your comments that Indigenous stories and learning are subjective versus objective. That relates a lot to the common question that settler asked in English class. What is the author's big idea? What are the questions do you recommend? What are the key questions do you recommend being asked in relation to Indigenous story work?
So I'm going to refer to Dr. Joanne Archibald. So when she teaches us story, what she does is she'll share the story with us, and then she'll ask us to just sit and reflect on it for a bit, right? So there's like silence, which a lot of people are really uncomfortable with, but for some reason, because the story kind of fills the room, she's there, you're all participants, you're part of this audience that has heard the story. So in that shared silence, you just kind of reflect on things that story made you think of, or maybe some challenges that you had with the story, or things that you appreciated about the story. And then she would open it up to, would anybody like to share? What did this story mean to you? How did this story make you feel? What were some of the thoughts that you had? And then you just engage in this collective dialogue. And that's part of what Archibald refers to as the synergy of the story, ideas coming alive, ideas in motion as you're sharing your interpretations. And then you're also making connections with other story listeners, right? Because a story listener might say, oh, this is what I thought of when Owl flew around that fire looking for that bone needle. It made me think of, and I remember a few times now, like that's a thought I've heard searching for the bone needle 101 times. That's something that I had never thought of. So it's just that group conversation, and nobody's right, nobody's wrong. Dr. Archibald, I've never seen her like redirect the conversation. It's just this natural unfolding of organic learning in the moment. So I'm not sure.
And talking about Dr. Archibald here, we have a question from Roy von Herding, who asks, can you explain the apparent contradiction, though maybe he misunderstood, between Dr. Archibald's writing down the stories and that they are not meant to be written down?
So the stories that she wrote in her book are, so her Sxwoxwiyam, those are her stories. So she, of course, does have the right to write down and publish her Sxwoxwiyam. And then the other stories that she uses in her book, she traced them back to where those stories came from, and she gained permission from everybody, whichever community, whichever nation was involved, and gained permission to use that story. And it wasn't that she did all of her pre-work ahead of time, right? Before she even started engaging with story and writing them down. And then I'm glad that she did, because of course she can't be everywhere all at once, but now we have her book, right? We're all able to learn about proper protocol and story work from the textbook that she published. So it's more about the protocol more so than the actual stories, although the stories are beautiful throughout the book.
Thank you. And then a question from Michaela McGuire, who says, hi, I'm not sure how to frame this question. That's okay, welcome here. Welcome to Science Talk. That's why we have this platform. But she finds herself very intimidated to engage with story work and story. What was that process like for you?
Long, arduous, very challenging. And the fact that you realize that means that you're on the right path, right? There's this realization that you do have to take your time, become what Dr. Archibald refers to as culturally prepared, even though like she's Stalo, she's from the Stalo community, and she still did work to culturally prepare herself so that she would be able to do the stories respect and work with them in a good way. So, and it's not something, as you mentioned at the beginning of these talks, becoming an expert in these fields doesn't happen overnight. It takes work and a lot of discussion and a lot of learning, a lot of mistakes, right? But as you go along, and for me, like I always say, I'm not a storyteller. It's not my gift. But there are people, I'm sure all of you have people in your social circles that when they tell stories, you're just like, oh, you can't wait for them to tell another story, right? You just can pick out people that just have that gift of storytelling.
And now we know there's your daughter that probably has that gift that
Yes.
she shared with us tonight.
Oh yes,
So
she's
if
very
you're looking
entertaining.
for a storyteller, that's great. And then so another question here, it's how are the various languages of the First Nations mainly learned orally, or is there a written language as well? And here, if I can just jump back from a funny story connected, coming up me in from Switzerland, there's what we call the Swiss German, which is only an oral language. It's not a written language. And when they write down, you write in High German, but people can write as they want, and it's shared with families and differs from one village to the other. So it's not a language that it's learned written. So, but let's see for your case here.
I honestly don't think that we can learn our language through written format. It is now written down. Brent Galloway and Burton Strang are two of the linguists that have worked with a lot of our elders to preserve the language, and we do have a written version of it now, but it's a very complicated language. So if you look at like Halkomelem is the upriver language, and then downriver we have Hunkkaminam, and then on the island we have Hulkaminam, right? So to the untrained ear, all of those sound the same: Halkomelem, Hunkkaminam, Hulkaminam. But the trained ear can tell the difference between all three of those dialects. So then as soon as somebody is talking, you're able to place that person in territory. You can tell where they're from. And also whether we do also have a high language and a low language, you can tell their status within our society based on how they're speaking the language. So, but to learn it just off the written alphabet is really challenging. I think it was earlier before we went live, I was telling you about my auntie and me trying to learn this one word, Sxwoxwiyam, which has to do with our matriarchs, like our oldest living female relative and the role that she plays in our families. And I can't get it right. She's corrected me 100 times, right? And it's just the at the end that I'm getting wrong every single time. So it's a very complex language. It's challenging to learn, but worth learning, I think.
Thank you. And then where actually can we could we learn or hear or listen more to Indigenous stories?
There are, I think one of the best things to do, because I think almost everybody is here in the Fraser Valley, is to befriend your Stalo neighbor, right? Get to know the First Nations community or the family living right beside you, right? And develop a relationship with the Stalo people and with the Indigenous peoples. And through the development of that relationship, you will, the stories will be shared with you like you're a member of the family. But it's part of developing that and bridging that gap I talked about earlier between settlers and Indigenous peoples, right? There's still that fear yet that we have to overcome. And the only way we can do it is by getting to know each other and developing relationships.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, I think it's probably for like this for when you encounter another culture too, and you just, hey, make a friend.
Yeah.
Make a friend, learn their language. Then it goes probably share a meal too.
Yes.
I assume.
Yes, absolutely. You always have to have food.
Yeah.
Sorry, I should also mention as well, there is a video that was done by Gwen Point, who Gwen is another storyteller for the Stalo people, and she's an educator within the system. So there is a video of, I believe it's the Sxwoxwiyam story that she shares online. So there's that as well, but not to take away from, you can't just watch the video, like still need to develop those relationships.
Nice. And there's actually quite a bit more question, but we'll have to wrap up. But let's see if we can take a couple more here. A lot of thank you. I think a lot of people have learned a lot tonight, so I think that's very good. A question from Sheila Fung. Did you see how I butcher her last name? I went a bit silent to make sure I was okay. Nobody heard anything.
No, I noticed.
All right. I really appreciate what you're saying about the ways of engaging with story. It sounds like a recipe for mitigating an education system that prioritizes a colonial empirical approach to knowledge making, which I mentioned earlier. Any advice on how to encourage this while also fostering students' ability to succeed within that system? I don't see them as diametrically opposed approaches, but I would love to gain a better understanding of what the relationship between the two approaches might look like.
Let's see. Well, I appreciate Joanne McLean being here, and I know I see a couple other of my UFE colleagues there. And part of like what we're doing is just creating space for this Indigenous way of knowing. So at UFE, for example, we have, I think we're approaching close to 15, 16, 17 courses now that are designed just for Indigenous ways of knowing. And the university has created space for that. So for example, we have a Stalo Communication and Worldview course. For that whole semester, that's all we're doing is working with story. And the majority of the students are settler, non-Indigenous students. So the beginning of the semester is just unlearning a lot of things about Indigenous peoples. And then in the middle of the semester, we begin engaging in story work and what that looks like. And then by the end of the semester, all of the students have developed their own Sxwoxwiyam that they then share with the rest of the class. So there is ways of bridging and bringing the two together. But you have to do your homework, right? It's not something. There's no quick fix. You have to do your homework.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, thank you very much for this this wonderful time with you that we were able to share and to share it with us tonight. I will bring this science talk to conclusion with a few announcements, but yeah, I was very pleased to meet you and share this journey, and I think about unlearning and relearning with you. And I'm hoping our path will cross again. I'm sure it will. It's a small valley.
Yep.
So here you all see my screen. So I believe, yes. So I just have, let me see. Yes. So the next few speakers for our series, we will have Anastasia and Anderson from the Center for Philosophy for Children. We'll have Edward Akufo for the Center for Global Development, and then Arvin Cohen from the Center for Public Safety and Criminal Justice Research. And that's all the different talks from the different centers and institute at UFE. So I encourage you all of you to join us. And you can register on sciencetalk.ca. We will also post this talk on YouTube, and people have mentioned previous talks that you can actually also go and see them. And some have are reaching a nice amount of views, which is very encouraging. And I'd like to thank again our partners in this journey. The University of Fraser Valley connects TEDx Abbotsford, the UFE Alumni Association, the Abbotsford Community Foundation, the City of Abbotsford, and the Vision. So thank you for helping us creating the space for the community and to stay connected in times of social distancing. That was the launch of this neighborhood grant we got. And you can find us on all social media. If you're on social media, don't hesitate to join us and follow this learning journey together. And we'd like to thank our sponsor volunteers. And feel free, this is a community effort, and there's no charge for tickets. But if you feel like this is worth doing and worth for us to keep doing it, don't hesitate to participate here. And I think maybe Josh will put the link. But this is this is it for me, and I would like to thank you again, everyone, for coming And I wish you an excellent evening, and yeah, and good luck with the rest of the semester that's just starting. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.